Near the west coast of modern-day Turkey sits a mountain shrouded in myth, Mount Sipilus. Legend says that it is the site of an ancient city where a young woman called Niobe became an exemplar of grief. Niobe had 14 children, 7 sons and 7 daughters, and flaunted her evident favor among the fates before the gods. And the Greek gods were furious, jealous, and incensed, so unleashed two of their kind, Apollo and Artemis, on a mission to massacre Niobe's brood. Apollo slaughtered her sons, and Artemis assassinated her daughters, and faced with devastation, Niobe fled to the peak of Mount Sipilus, overcome with grief, to bereave her loss. And it is there, on that mountain, where she wept for 9 days straight until she was turned to stone, leaving a rock formation still visited today by thousands of tourists each year, Aglayan Kaya, which means the weeping rock. So powerful, legend says, were her tears that they continued to flow through her petrified eyes, staining the stone for centuries. And so potent was her grief that it has come to embody loss and lamentation, not just in Greek myth, but across the history of Western literature, from Greece to Britain to America, as she is cited by Sophocles and Shakespeare and Faulkner. And despite the fact that Charles Darwin claims that crying, as far as he can tell, is biologically purposeless, our moral imagination has known for millennia that tears possess a remarkable power and reflect something far deeper than a feeble secretion of the lacrimal glands. We know that they stem from what Edward Young called the cisterns in the soul. And we know this because beyond Niobe, the Greeks believed that amber, the gemstone capable of bearing an electric charge, is the coagulated tears of Helios's grieving sisters. And the ancient Egyptians believed that the goddess Isis wept so profoundly over the loss of her murdered brother Osiris that her tears brought him back to life and flooded the Nile. Dante, the Italian poet, depicted the source of the rivers of hell, in which residents are variously boiled, drowned, and frozen, as the tears shed by history itself, suggesting that human pain has a power so profound as to be capable of punishing sinners even in death. And 7 centuries later, Lewis Carroll's Alice nearly drowns herself in Wonderland in a stream of her own tears. And of course, the masterpiece of the last few decades, Harry Potter, shows him being saved more than once by the healing tears of a grieving phoenix. And tears are no less powerful in our own Jewish tradition. Every year, we sound the shofar 100 times on Rosh Hashanah, evoking the cries of Sisera's mother, because tears of grief have such force that even the wail of an enemy can change the course of our destiny. Our sages go as far as to suggest that Yitzchak's blindness in his later life was a result of crying when the very angels wept at his binding, and their tears fell from heaven onto his face. Writer Tom Lutz, in his The History of Tears, and clinical psychologist Ad Vingerholtz in his Why Only Humans Weep, both show how universal is this notion that human beings grieving and weeping and wailing is unique, how us tearing up and breaking down is seen as shaking the foundations of the cosmos. Our sages themselves put it pithily when they said, Miyom shenecharav bet hamikdash, from the day that the temple was destroyed, Nena'alu sharei tefillah, the gates of prayer were closed. Va'af al pisha sharei tefillah nena'alu, but even though the gates of prayer have been closed, sharei dema'ot lo na'alu, the gates of tears remain open. Which all leads us to a rather curious moment in the text that we read this morning. Because at the side of a well enclosed by a stone, our third and final forefather met our fourth and final foremother, and his reaction to this encounter seems beyond strange. Rachel ba'a im hatzon, we're told that Rachel approached with the sheep. V'yishag Yaakov l'Rachel, and Jacob kissed Rachel. V'yisad kalo v'yevk, and he raised his voice, and he cried. And we could, of course, ask why Yaakov kissed a woman he had just met, and many of the commentators do address that question. But today, this is my question. Why does he cry? Having kissed the woman he wishes to marry, live to see a wish fulfilled, why does he cry? In his Chumash, Chief Rabbi Hertz cites a biblical scholar who says that this demonstrative display of feeling is Homeric in its simplicity. But there is nothing simple about this manifestly unexpected display of feeling. And to compound the question, so far from the birth of humankind until this encounter, we are told in the Bible of a person crying only 3 times. The first to weep is Hagar, winding through the wilderness parched with thirst, her son on the verge of death. V'tisad kola v'yet v'tef, she wails into the wind and bemoans her fate until an angel saves her. The second to cry is Avraham. In the wake of his wife's sudden death, he arrives on the scene, delivers a eulogy, and weeps. V'yavo Avraham lisbod l'Sarah v'liv kota. And the third to cry is Yaakov's brother Esav. Having been disinherited, he is possessed of a deep remorse and a mounting rage, and weeps. V'yisa Esav kolo vayef. Each of the three stood in the midst of an unimaginable grief, one evicted and stripped of a home, another deprived of a wife and left widowed, and the last left unblessed and robbed of hope. But why now does Yaakov cry? It is true that he has left home to flee from his brother's anger, but it has been at the very least days and days and days since that flight began. Why now, having met the woman that he wants to marry, does he seem to grieve? And so compelling is this question that at least 6 possibilities have been proposed. One midrash alone offers 3. One option, the midrash says, is that Yaakov was weeping from shame. He was grieving the loss of his good name, as the local herdsman saw him kiss Rachel and began to whisper about his impropriety. Melach Hashim elu la'elu. Seeing his seeming immodesty, they gossiped and branded him a reprobate. Another suggestion is that Yaakov wept from regret, not at the loss of his name, but at the shame of indigence. Knowing that his father's bride had been won with camels laden with wealth, he stood before the woman of his dreams, penniless, with nothing to offer as a symbol of his love. Lo nezem echad v'lo tzamid echad, not a single bracelet or bangle, so he cried. And third, in that same midrash, the sages say, Davar acher, maybe there's another explanation. Perhaps Yaakov wept in grief at the prospect of an eternity apart from the woman he had just met. Perhaps he knew, the sages say, that though they would wed, they would be separated in death, one buried in a cave and the other on the way to Ephrat. Ra'ah, he saw, she'ina nechneset imo likfura, that she would not be buried next to him. Finding all 3 reasons to grieve somewhat insufficient, the medieval mystic Rabbi Moshe Alshich adds a 4th possibility. Perhaps, he says, Yaakov was so awed by Rachel's beauty that he grieved for the very nature of our material condition that decays and erodes and deteriorates. In the ravages of times, perhaps, Bacha al-Hu Shufra, he cried and wept about the beauty, the Bale Ba'ara that would one day be buried beneath the sand. And the Italian rationalist Avogadro Sforno takes a 5th route, a far more personal route, a far more romantic route. And he suggests that Yaakov weeps for the time that he could have had together with Rachel had they only met years before. He grieves over the days and the week not spent with Rachel. He cries not for the future, but for the time that they have already lost. Shelo zacha laset ota ben orav, that he didn't merit to marry her in his youth. So we have 5 different readings of Yaakov's cry, only the 4th tears shed in the Torah, each characterizing his grief and depicting his loss in a new way, all a variation on him tormented by our material condition and his particular position. But there is a 6th way, a reading offered by the Radak that sees Yaakov as a radical, a maverick, even as an inventor. Radak suggests that Yaakov is not the 4th to shed tears of grief, but the first to secrete tears of joy. In his words, Zuhi b'chiyah shel simcha, this was a cry of celebration. For the first time in recorded history, bliss is expressed in tears. Yaakov shows that we can be moved not only by loss, but equally by love, and that gratitude can be just as strong as grief, as King Solomon would later say, Azach amavet ahava, love is as fierce as death. And we know that just like grief, Yaakov's addition to the lexicon of human emotions is transmissible. Because the very next time that someone cries in the biblical text, it spreads from Yaakov to a man who had wanted him dead. After decades of separation and years of frustration, Esav and his brother come face to face, but instead of murder, we see an embrace. Vayaratz Esav likrato v'chabkeu. Esav ran to greet him and hugged him. V'yipol al tzavarav. He fell on his shoulders. V'shakeu, and he kissed him. Vayivku, and they cried. So now for the second time, tears express joy, not grief, but relief, not loss, but love, not sorrow, but celebration. As one commentator on that moment says, Yaakov nitorer alav l'sha'azu. Jacob awakened, if just for a moment, ahaval Esav, love in his brother Esav. Alan Fisk, professor of anthropology at UCLA, has studied human bonding and connectivity and has noted that it is only in the recent past that students of human emotion have recognized what is called kamamuta as a motive for tears. The kamamuta is a term from Sanskrit meaning moved by love, and if you've ever teared up or cried in response to a touching ad or scene in a movie that does not resemble loss or tragedy, you have been moved by kamamuta, by love, to tears. And it may be that the term is taken from Sanskrit, but the spirit of tears triggered by love goes back to scripture and our collective father in a moment that he cries, for the first time in recorded biblical history, moved not by loss, but by love. And in that spirit, I want to take this moment to say how moved I am by the devotion shown by those who have spent so many hours this past week on making our clothing sale at Vayeitzei come together. I know that it isn't easy, and I haven't been as available as I would like, but there are people who have given up their days and their nights to support our shul and those in need. And on behalf of all of us, I thank you deeply for all your work. I want to thank Jenna Herskowitz, Susan Cass, and Lisa Rudolph for spearheading this colossal undertaking. And also I want to thank Pessy Butler, Olivia Rosick, Elliot and Cyril Goldovsky, Esther Kurzman, Ellen Freilich, Sharon Hurt, and Ruth Summer, Judy Waslawski, Debbie King, John Kramer, Harvey Rosenblum, Noel Mishkov, Moshe and Zipporah Boym, Arnie Mandelstam, Sam Herskowitz, and Harold Biller for all that they've done to contribute to this effort. I will be in shul if you're watching this on Motzei Shabbat this evening, and I will be in and out over the course of the coming days, and I invite every single one of you who are able to join me and find a way to be present and participate in this signal of our devotion to our community in Vayeitzei and beyond. And in the meantime, I wish you a week overflowing with a love that moves you. Shavua Tov.